Have you got strong written English skills? But whenever you try to speak to somebody in English, maybe some of the language that you use, some of the words that you would normally use when you're typing an email or sending some sort of a text message, those words just don't seem to land when you speak them out loud in a real life conversation. It's almost like the person at the other end suddenly goes a little bit quiet. The language that you use just hasn't landed properly. From my experience of living and working in Hong Kong for over 20 years, I came across this issue quite a lot. When we learn a language such as English, we start off with the vocabulary, we put it all together in a grammatical phrase, then we put together larger chunks of text over a period of time, and we get into the habit of writing in a certain way. We're looking to communicate in a very succinct, concise, um, short form. And that's great for writing for business purposes when we're trying to get our message across quickly and smoothly. But the problem is when we try to translate that mode of communication into our speech, into our conversation, particularly in our business English conversations. And language, phrases, words, vocabulary that we might use in business, written business English, doesn't necessarily translate well when it comes to real life business English conversations. So I just want to go through a few of these expressions and just explain from a native speaker's point of view how these written English expressions that are used frequently in business English writing don't land very well when it comes to a real life conversation. So, for example, number one would be noted. How many times do we use noted in our business English writing? And generally speaking, in business English, that is acceptable to reply in such a way. In fact, it would almost be encouraged because the point has landed, the message has been understood quickly, and we can move on to our next email, our next correspondence. But when we're in a live conversation, if someone is taking the time to explain something to us, particularly when we're dealing with people from Western cultures, where the culture is far more indirect than Eastern cultures, we have to be careful not to come across as being too direct. And a word or expression which is used in writing um, is direct in writing, and that suits the culture, for example, in Asia. And in fact, Western culture has come to accept that form of communication, written communication as well, but not necessarily in spoken English when you're dealing with Western cultures. So, for example, if you say noted to someone when you're in a real life conversation with them, it really comes across as being quite dismissive and that you, in fact, not even really taken the time to take on board what they've got to say. A much better way of replying would be, thank you very much for explaining that to me. I have taken on board everything that you have said. Another word which is used very frequently in written business English is the word unfortunately. Now, how many times have we received a letter which starts with the word unfortunately? And we know exactly what's coming. In fact, we very rarely would read the rest of the letter. Anything which starts with the word unfortunately is 99% of the time a rejection of some form. It could be for a job, it could be for some sort of a proposal, but it's more than likely going to be a rejection. So we've got this incredibly negative perception of the word unfortunately. So if you use that word in your conversation as well, it has a tremendously negative effect, unsurprisingly. Unfortunately, in effect, is a hard stop. It is signaling to the other person that there is no further point in continuing the conversation, particularly on this particular topic area. I think a much better way of expressing yourself is to use the word struggling instead of the word unfortunately, because the word struggling is not a hard no, and it shows that you are still trying and have been trying to meet the needs of the person that you're talking to, but it's just incredibly difficult. I think in Western culture, whilst we do have to say no, that's important. We have to be selective with regards to when we do actually say a hard no and be mindful of the fact that when we do come up with a hard no in all its various different shapes and forms, that will shut down a conversation dead. And in business, it's not advisable to do that because in business, we are continually looking to grow relationships. And a hard no stops relationships in their tracks. Next one is as soon as possible. Now, as soon as possible appears a lot in written English. And even in written English, I would not say this is a particularly good expression to be using, but it's even worse when it's translated through into spoken English. We all know full well that as soon as possible means that we have got no idea when we can commit to something. So all that expression does is frustrate the other person. And although it may be difficult, it is always better to try to give some sort of time frame to whatever you are discussing. Now, that time frame doesn't need to be concrete. You can say that we are trying our best to meet whatever particular date rather than just say as soon as possible. As soon as possible literally does mean absolutely nothing at all, and it is nothing more than a frustrating delaying tactic, which will just annoy and anger the other person. The final one is let's touch base later. And this is quite common after a conversation with someone, particularly if they are a new contact, to say let's touch base later. That gives no time frame at all. So the other person might be thinking, when should we touch base? Are we really going to touch base? It leaves a level of confusion there. And a far better way of expressing yourself is to give some sort of time frames because, similar to as soon as possible, it gives no concrete commitment at all. And without any concrete commitment, there can be a level of confusion. And if there is too much confusion, especially in business, it leads to downward spiraling relationships. And that is precisely the wrong direction for relationships to be traveling in. When it comes to business English, we must always remember that we must think about how our words make people feel. And we need to leave people with a positive impression of ourselves, both right now and going forward into the future. And if our words don't do that, then they are the wrong words. But the good news is, with just a very few small tweaks, we can change how people feel about us and, more importantly, about the message that we are delivering so that the outcomes of our conversation are far more positive and we are moving our relationship in a positive upward direction rather than a negative downward direction.